A quiet night in Galesburg, Illinois, right off the interstate, where travelers come and go without a second thought. In the summer of 1980, one man checked into a hotel, just passing through town. By morning, he was dead. This is Kristen, and you're on Small Town Big Talk, Galesburg, Illinois. Let's get into it. Jumer's hotel murder, Galesburg's strangest unsolved case. This man was brutally murdered in his bed. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, just a scattered wallet. And one of the strangest clues ever found at a crime scene: toothpaste. Tonight, we're diving into one of Galesburg's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. A lot of people around Galesburg connect this case to Jumer's, but the actual crime happened at what was then known as the Sheridan Motor Inn, located right off Interstate 74. Back in 1980, this area was a hotspot for travelers, salesmen, truckers, people just passing through town for a night. And that's exactly what brought William Kyle to Galesburg. He wasn't from here. He didn't have family here. He was just passing through. And somehow, he became the victim of a murder that would never be solved. William Kyle was about 28 years old, a traveling salesman, meaning he spent a lot of nights in places just like this hotel. For him, this was routine. Check in, sleep, and then get back on the road. Nothing about this night should have been different. But something or someone entered his room and changed everything. The next morning, William Kyle was found dead in his room. His body was partially off the bed, face down. He had been brutally beaten to death. Investigators believe the weapon was something like a hatchet or a small axe. This wasn't a quick crime. This was violent, personal. And then things got strange. His wallet had been emptied, its contents scattered around the room. There was no clear sign of forced entry, which means he may have let the killer in, or the killer already had access. But the detail that has haunted this case for decades was found on the floor near his body. Toothpaste. Toothpaste squeezed out onto the carpet. Think about that for a second. In the middle of a brutal murder scene, someone stopped and squeezed toothpaste onto the floor. That's crazy to me. Investigators were completely baffled. It didn't match robbery. It didn't match rage. It just didn't make sense. One of the theories suggested that could be something even darker. That the killer may have had drug issues, possibly heroin, and that this behavior could be tied to disturbing psychological or sexual compulsions, which raises a terrifying question. Was this really about robbery at all? Or was William Kyle targeted for something much more disturbing? Police eventually zeroed in on a suspect, Raimundo Esparza, a drifter, a known heroin user. Witnesses placed him at the hotel that same night. Some say he was carrying a bag of tools something that could easily include a hatchet. On paper, it seemed like a fit. But here's the problem. There was no solid evidence tying him directly to the crime. No DNA. No weapon recorded. Just suspicion. And before anything could be proven, Esparza died in 1983, taking whatever truth he may have known to the grave. Years later, investigators began noticing something chilling. This wasn't the only case like this. Similar murders popped up in the other states. Victims in hotel rooms, attacked in their beds with hatchet-like weapons. And in some cases, that same strange detail. Toothpaste. So weird to me. Could this mean Galesburg wasn't just a scene of a random murder, but part of a serial killer's path across the country? A killer who moved from town to town, targeting people who would never be missed locally because they didn't belong there in the first place. To this day, the murder of William Kyle remains unsolved. No arrests, no closure, just questions. Was it a robbery gone wrong? A disturbed drifter? Or something much bigger? A killer passing through towns like Galesburg, leaving behind nothing but confusion and fear. And maybe the most chilling thought of all, if it was a serial killer, how many other towns have a story just like this one? I thought maybe you guys would also like to know who was involved in trying to get this murder to come together. So I kind of looked into it more and found out who investigated the case. So we're going to talk about something that often gets overlooked in this case: who was actually responsible for investigating the murder of William Kyle. So back in 1980, the primary agency handling the case was the Galesburg Police Department, and they were the first on the scene. And then they are the ones who processed the hotel room and the ones who began piecing together what happened that night. But because of the nature of the crime, a brutal homicide involving a traveling victim, the case likely didn't stay local for long. Then the Illinois State Police stepped in. They typically assist in major crimes like this, especially when the case is complex. There's potential for suspects traveling across jurisdictions, or when additional forensic support is needed. And remember, this was 1980, so crime scene technology wasn't what it is today. So investigators were relying heavily on physical evidence, witness statements, and good old-fashioned detective work. Now, here's where it gets real interesting. Because of the possibility that this crime could be linked to other states, it opens the door to another agency being involved, or at least notified. I think you kind of guessed it, the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI often becomes involved when there's a chance a crime crosses state lines, especially in cases that may involve a serial offender. However, there's no strong public record showing that the FBI officially took over this case, which means most of the investigation likely remained at the local and state level. And that may be one of the reasons that this case was never fully solved. Because if this was part of a larger pattern, the connections may not have been fully recognized at the time, and the killer may have slipped through the cracks. And it makes you wonder, if this case happened today with DNA databases, surveillance, and national coordination, would we finally have answers about what really happened to that poor man in his room at night? What if the murder in Galesburg wasn't random? What if it wasn't even local? What if the man killed in that hotel room was just one stop on a much darker journey? A journey that may have stretched across multiple states with one killer who left behind the same chilling signature. Tonight, we're asking the question no one ever answered. Was Galesburg part of a serial killer's route? After the murder of William Kyle in 1980, the case went cold. No arrests, no closure. But years later, investigators started noticing something unsettling. There were other murders in other states that looked almost identical. Victims found in hotel rooms, attacked while in bed, killed with a blunt force weapon, often something like a hatchet. And then that detail, that crazy detail, the one that doesn't belong, in my opinion. Toothpaste. Let's break down this like investigators, shall we? Because patterns are everything. Across multiple cases, we see victims traveling alone, hotels near major highways, attacked while vulnerable, usually in bed. No forced entry, wallets disturbed, brutal overkill style violence. And in some cases, the same bizarre clue, toothpaste. That's not coincidence. That's behavior. And in my opinion, that is a signature. Now think about this. What connects Galesburg to places like Iowa or even Mississippi? Highways. Interstate 74 runs right through Galesburg. In the 70s and 80s, highways were lifelines for traveling salesmen, drifters, truck drivers, and potentially a killer. Someone who could move from town to town, blend in for a night, if you will, and disappear before morning. No connections, no patterns, at least not obvious ones, unless you zoom out and see the bigger picture. So, where does that leave the main suspect, Raimundo Esparza? Some believe he was exactly what police thought, a drifter with a violent edge. But others ask a different question. Was he just convenient? A man who fit the profile, but not necessarily the crime. Because if this was part of a larger pattern, then the real killer may have never been identified at all and could have continued long after leaving Galesburg. Let's talk about the kind of person capable of this. This wasn't clean. This wasn't quick. This was personal. And even if the victim wasn't, the toothpaste clue, it suggests something deeper, something ritualistic or I can't say the word right ever. Psychological. A need to act out, not just kill. And that's what makes this case so disturbing. Because if that behavior was repeated, then this wasn't a one-time crime. This was someone who had done it before and may have done it. So now we're left with two possibilities. One, a random act of violence by a man who was never proven guilty. Or two, Galesburg, Illinois was just one stop in a series of murders. committed by someone who knew exactly how to disappear. And maybe the scariest part of all, if no one ever connected the cases, how many more are out there still waiting to be linked? Now let's take a step back for a second and ask a powerful question. What if this murder happened today? Because the truth is, 1980 and today are two completely different worlds when it comes to solving crimes. Back then, investigators didn't have DNA databases, advanced forensic testing, surveillance cameras everywhere, or digital footprints. But today, this case would look very different. That hotel room would be processed with extreme precision. Every surface tested for DNA, every fiber, every hair, every trace collected. Even something as small as that toothpaste could potentially hold DNA. And that's where things get interesting. Because today, investigators can take DNA and run it through national databases or even use genetic genealogy. The same method used to catch the Golden State Killer decades later, which means a killer who thought they got away with it in 1980 might not get away with it today. And then there's surveillance. Think about it. Hotels today have cameras, parking lots, hallways, and entrances. That killer walking in or out would likely have been seen. And even beyond that, cell phones, credit cards, GPS, it's almost impossible now to move through a place without leaving some kind of trail, which brings us to a haunting thought. We're reopening today with modern technology. Could William Kyle finally get justice? Or has too much time already passed? In cold cases like this, everything comes down to one thing, and that's evidence. Even decades later, physical evidence can still exist. Things like clothing, bedding, hair fibers, items left in the room, and possibly that toothpaste. If any of that was preserved, it could be retested using modern forensic tools that didn't exist in 1980. One of the biggest breakthroughs in modern investigations is something called genetic genealogy. This is how investigators caught the Golden State Killer. He was a man who went undetected for decades. They didn't find him through fingerprints or eyewitnesses. They found him through family DNA by building a family tree and narrowing it down. So imagine this. If DNA from the Galesburg crime scene still exists, investigators today could potentially trace it to a living relative of the killer, which means even if the killer is gone, his identity might not be. So here's the original suspect, Raimundo Esparza. Back then, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. But today, if DNA existed, it could either confirm or completely clear him, which would change everything. Because if he didn't do it, then the real killer was never even identified. But here's the reality of cold cases. Time is not always on their side. Evidence can be lost, degraded, or even destroyed. Witnesses do forget or pass away, and sometimes the trail just disappears, which makes cases like this so frustrating. Because the truth might still exist, but it's just out of reach. Here we are, decades later, still asking the same question. What really happened in that hotel room? Was it a random act, a traveling killer, or a mystery it has never been solved yet? Because maybe this story isn't over. Maybe the evidence is still out there waiting for someone to take one more look. This is your host, Kristen. Small town, big talk, Galesburg, Illinois. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Subscribe if you haven't already. And I'd like to know your comments. If any of you know anything or remember how Galesburgians were back then when this murder went down, feel free to leave me an email or write your comments below. I would love to hear from you. Until next time, Galesburg, see you later.